Picture this. It's 1630 in a small Italian town. Hundreds of people are gathered for a religious procession honoring St. Francis of Assisi. The crowd is pressing forward, candles flickering, prayers rising into the autumn air. Among them is a young priest named Joseph, awkward, simple-minded, the kind of man people called the gaper because he walked around with his mouth hanging open, lost in his own world. And then it happens. Without warning, Joseph lets out a piercing scream, so loud it frightens everyone around him. His body goes rigid, his eyes roll back, and then he lifts off the ground. Not an inch, not a foot. He soars above the crowd like a bird taking flight, his brown Franciscan robes billowing beneath him as he hovers in the air, motionless, suspended in what witnesses would later describe as pure ecstasy. Women scream. Men fall to their knees. Children point upward in disbelief. For several minutes, the entire procession stops as a simple, unremarkable priest floats above them all. When he finally descends, when his feet touch the earth again, Joseph is so humiliated, so mortified by what just happened, that he runs away and hides his mother's house. But this wasn't a one-time event. This wasn't mass hysteria. This wasn't a trick. Over the next 33 years of his life, Joseph of Cupertino would levitate more than 70 documented times, in front of cardinals, scientists, nobility, skeptics, and even the Pope himself. His levitations were so frequent, so undeniable, so thoroughly witnessed that the Catholic Church launched multiple investigations. The Spanish Inquisition itself examined him, searching for fraud, for witchcraft, for any natural explanation. They found none. This is the true story of the man they called the Flying Friar, the most documented case of human levitation in history. And if you think you know how this story ends, think again. Because what happened to Joseph of Cupertino is stranger, more controversial, and more mind-bending than any legend. The story begins not with miracles, but with misery. Giuseppe Dessa was born on June 17, 1603, in the Kingdom of Naples, in a tiny village called Cupertino. And from the very moment of his birth, luck seemed to abandon him. His father, Felix, was a carpenter, but not a successful one. He was drowning in debt, hunted by creditors, forced to sell everything the family owned just to survive. On the very day Joseph's mother Francesca went into labor, bailiffs arrived to seize their home. With nowhere else to go, she gave birth to her son in a shed behind the house, the same kind of stable where another famous Joseph had been born 16 centuries earlier. It was an omen of the humility that would define his life. Then, when Joseph was still an infant, his father died, leaving the family in crushing poverty. His mother became harsh, cold, bitter. She had no patience for this strange child who seemed to live in another world. While other boys played and worked and learned, little Giuseppe would stop mid-step and stare at the sky, his mouth hanging open, completely oblivious to everything around him. The other children mocked him mercilessly. They called him Baccaperta, the gaper, because he walked around like a fool with his jaw slack, gazing at nothing. But here's what they didn't understand. Joseph wasn't staring at nothing. He was staring at everything. From his earliest years, Joseph saw the world differently than everyone else. Where others saw trees, he saw the fingerprints of God. Where others heard birdsong, he heard divine music. A sunset could send him into a trance. A flower could make him weep with joy. He was so consumed by the beauty and mystery of creation that the ordinary world, the world of work and conversation and responsibility, barely registered to him at all. He tried to fit in. He really did. When he was old enough, his mother forced him to apprentice as a shoemaker. He was terrible at it. His mind would wander in the middle of stitching a sole, and he'd ruin the leather. He was fired. He tried working in the fields. He'd space out while hoeing and accidentally destroy crops. He was fired again. Everywhere he went, people saw him as a failure, clumsy, useless, stupid. His own mother verbally abused him, calling him a lazy good-for-nothing. But deep inside, Joseph burned with a singular desire. He wanted to become a priest. He wanted to dedicate his life to God. There was just one problem. He couldn't learn anything. Joseph applied to join the Franciscan friars. They rejected him. His education was too poor. He applied to the Capuchins. They accepted him briefly, But when he kept dropping dishes and ruining meals during his duties in the kitchen, they kicked him out. He was a disaster at everything he touched. Desperate and humiliated, Joseph returned to his hometown. He went to the local conventual Franciscan monastery and begged, literally begged, just to be allowed to work in their stables. Not as a friar, not as a priest, just as a stable boy, caring for their mule and horses. The friars took pity on him. They gave him the worst job in the monastery, mucking out stables, carrying water, sleeping on hay. And this is where something remarkable began to happen. Joseph started to change. In the silence of the stables, away from the judgment of others, he began to pray deeply, constantly, with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He would work all day caring for the animals, then spend entire nights on his knees in the chapel. He started fasting, eating solid food only twice a week. He wore an iron chain beneath his clothes as a form of penance to punish Brother Ass, as he called his own body. The other friars began to notice. This simple, stable boy, this man everyone had written off, radiated something they couldn't quite name. Humility, devotion, joy, despite his poverty, despite his humiliation, despite everything. Joseph was genuinely, inexplicably happy. After several years, the friars were so impressed by his transformation that they did something unprecedented. They admitted him into Franciscan order. Joseph would get his chance to become a priest after all. But first, he'd have to pass his exams. And that's when the miracles began. When the time came for his ordination as a deacon, Joseph stood before the examining bishop, trembling with fear. The bishop opened the Bible at random, a common practice, to select a passage for Joseph to interpret. His finger landed on a page. He looked down. It was Joseph's verse, the only one he truly understood. Joseph began to speak, and suddenly, words poured out of him like water from a spring. He spoke about the Blessed Virgin Mary, about divine motherhood, about the mystery of the Incarnation, with an eloquence that stunned everyone in the room. It was as if he were channeling something beyond himself. The bishop was so impressed, he ordained him on the spot. One hurdle cleared. One more to go. A year later came the priesthood examination, the final test. Joseph was grouped with several other candidates. One by one, the bishop questioned them. The first candidate answered brilliantly. The second, even better. The third was a theological master. The bishop smiled, satisfied. If these men are so well prepared, he announced, surely the rest are equally qualified. He ordained them all without further questions. Joseph of Cupertino, the worst student in seminary history, had become a priest through what can only be described as divine intervention, or spectacular luck, or both. He was assigned to the convent of Santa Maria della Gratella, just outside his hometown. He was 25 years old. He was finally a priest. He could finally serve God the way he'd always dreamed. And then the Levitations started. In the monastery dining hall, he'd levitate during meals, floating above the table with a plate of food still in his hands while his fellow friars stared in disbelief. Once, while out begging for alms in the countryside, something beautiful caught his attention. Perhaps a bird, perhaps the way sunlight fell through leaves, and he launched straight up into a tree, perching on a high branch in ecstatic prayer, while confused villagers gathered below. The most famous incident involved construction, workers struggling to erect a massive stone cross. They couldn't lift it into place. It was too heavy, too unwieldy. Joseph approached, fell into a trance, and before anyone could stop him, he rose into the air, grabbed the cross, and placed it perfectly in its socket, all while hovering above the ground. The workers fell to their knees. Here's what's crucial to understand. Joseph hated this. He was deeply embarrassed by his levitations. They made him feel like a spectacle, like a circus performer. He called them fits of giddiness, and tried desperately to control them. He couldn't. The trigger was always the same: beauty, devotion, divine presence. A piece of sacred music would play, and he'd shoot up toward the ceiling. Someone would mention the Virgin Mary, and he'd be airborne. Even the sight of a particularly stunning sunset could send him hovering, and he couldn't feel anything when it happened. His fellow friars, trying to test whether he was faking, would burn him with hot coals and prick him with pins while he levitated. Joseph never flinched. He was completely unconscious, lost in what mystics call divine ecstasy, a state of union with God so complete that the physical world ceased to exist. Word spread quickly. Within months, people were traveling from across Italy to witness the flying friar. Crowds packed the monastery church, hoping to see Joseph levitate during Massachusetts. Some came out of devotion, others came out of skepticism. None left unchanged. But not everyone was convinced, and some were downright suspicious. In 17th century Italy, the line between miracle and witchcraft was dangerously thin. The Spanish Inquisition was in full force, burning heretics and hunting down anyone suspected of supernatural powers. Flying was especially suspicious. It was exactly the kind of thing witches were accused of doing. Rumors began to swirl about Joseph. Was this genuine holiness or demonic deception? Was he a saint or a sorcerer? In 1639, Joseph was denounced to the Inquisition. Imagine the terror. The Inquisition didn't investigate lightly. They tortured. They burned. They destroyed lives based on accusations alone. Joseph was summoned to Naples, where cold-eyed inquisitors questioned him for hours, searching for any sign of fraud, heresy, or demonic pact. They examined his theology. They tested his orthodoxy. They watched him like hawks, looking for sleight of hand, for hidden wires, for any trick that could explain his levitations. They found nothing. Joseph's faith was simple but genuine. His humility was undeniable. His devotion was beyond question. The inquisitors couldn't convict him of anything, but they couldn't dismiss him either. Instead, they made a decision that would define the rest of Joseph's life: confinement. He was transferred from monastery to monastery, kept under constant supervision, forbidden from celebrating public masses. For the next 18 years, Joseph lived essentially under house arrest, moved from Assisi to Pietrarubia to Fossombrone, always watched, always suspected, always isolated. His superiors wanted to hide him. The Levitations were too controversial, too disruptive, too impossible to explain. But the more they tried to suppress Joseph, the more the story spread. Because here's the thing, Joseph kept levitating. He couldn't stop. Let's talk about who actually saw Joseph levitate. Because this isn't a case of gullible peasants believing fairy tales. The eyewitness list is staggering. Pope Urban VIII himself, one of the most powerful men in Europe, witnessed Joseph levitate during a private audience in Rome. Joseph was so overcome with devotion in the Pope's presence that he rose into the air right in front of the Holy Father. The Pope reportedly had ordered Joseph's religious superior to command him back down to earth. The Spanish ambassador to the papal court, Admiral of Castile, traveled to Assisi specifically to meet Joseph in 1645. During their conversation, Joseph suddenly cried out and flew across the room to a statue, embracing it while hovering in midair. The admiral and his entire family witnessed it firsthand. Duke Johann Friedrich of Brunswick, a Lutheran prince considering conversion to Catholicism, met Joseph in 1649. Watching the humble friar levitate during prayer was reportedly one of the experiences that convinced the Duke to convert. Countless cardinals, bishops, doctors, and scholars documented Joseph's flights in official depositions. These weren't anonymous rumors. They were sworn testimonies given under oath, recorded in the Church's canonization proceedings, cross-examined, and verified. Over the course of his lifetime, Joseph levitated more than 70 documented times in front of hundreds of witnesses. And here's what makes it impossible to dismiss. Many of these witnesses were skeptics. They came hoping to expose a fraud. They left as believers. Dr. Michael Grosso, a philosopher who spent decades researching Joseph's case, described it as the most outstanding case of levitation in history, witnessed by multitudes. The sheer volume of testimony, the diversity of witnesses, the consistency of the accounts across decades, it all points to something genuinely unexplainable happening. Carlos Era, a Yale historian specializing in early modern history, studied Joseph's case extensively. Even as a scholar trained to be skeptical, Era admitted, "It's difficult to dismiss testimonies about his levitations as lies or mass hysteria. The quantity and status of eyewitnesses make their accounts seem credible. But the story doesn't end with witnesses and wonder. It ends with something far more profound. In 1657, After 18 years of confinement and surveillance, Joseph was finally allowed to return to a normal Franciscan community. He was sent to Osimo, a quiet monastery where he could live out his days in relative peace. By now, his body was ravaged by decades of extreme fasting and self-mortification. He was frail, exhausted, worn down by the very devotion that had elevated him. On September 18, 1663, at the age of 60, Joseph of Cupertino died peacefully in his cell. The Levitations stopped. The flying friar would fly no more. But his story was just beginning. The Catholic Church launched an exhaustive investigation into Joseph's life. From 1664 to 1695, officials interviewed hundreds of witnesses, collecting depositions, examining evidence, searching for any sign of fraud or exaggeration. The resulting documentation filled 13 volumes now kept in the Vatican Library. In 1753, Joseph was beatified, declared blessed, one step from sainthood. In 1767, Pope Clement XIII officially canonized him as Saint Joseph of Cupertino. Today, he's the patron saint of aviators, astronauts, students, and those with learning disabilities. The city of Cupertino, California, home to Apple Incorporated, is named after him. Students facing exams pray to him, asking the dumbest saint who somehow passed his test to help them pass theirs. Pilots invoke his protection. Anyone who's ever felt stupid, inadequate, or overlooked finds hope in his story. But here's the deeper question. Why did Joseph levitate? Some scientists have speculated about quantum forces, about undiscovered properties of consciousness, about the brain's hidden capabilities. Skeptics dismiss the entire thing as athletic leaps, optical illusions, or mass delusion, though they struggle to explain away the sheer number and quality of eyewitnesses. Believers see something simpler and more profound, a soul so filled with love for God that even gravity couldn't hold it down. G.K. Chesterton once wrote, "Angels can fly because they take themselves lightly." Joseph of Cupertino was the most humble man imaginable. He thought of himself as worthless, stupid, a burden. But in that very humility, in that lightness of spirit, he touched something that defied the laws of physics. His levitations weren't about power. They were about surrender. They weren't about control. They were about letting go. Every time Joseph rose into the air, he wasn't ascending through will or effort. He was being lifted by something far greater than himself. And maybe that's the real miracle. Not that he flew, but that he showed us what's possible when we stop trying to hold ourselves down. To this day, scholars debate what really happened in those Italian monasteries. Was Joseph of Cupertino a genuine levitator, defying everything we know about physics and reality? Was he an extraordinary athlete creating elaborate illusions? Was he suffering from some unknown psychological condition that made him genuinely believe he was flying? Or was he, as millions of Catholics believe, touched by divine grace, a living sign that this world is stranger, more mysterious, and more wonder-filled than our rational minds want to admit? Here's what we know for certain. Joseph was real. The eyewitnesses were real. The documentation is real. The Catholic Church investigated his case more thoroughly than almost any other in history and found no evidence of fraud. Something happened to Joseph of Cupertino. Something that hundreds of people saw with their own eyes. Something that changed lives, sparked conversions, and inspired generations. Maybe we'll never know the full truth. Maybe that's the point. Maybe some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to remind us that reality is far stranger than we imagine. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you're feeling small, inadequate, or stuck to the ground by the weight of your failures, you'll remember the boy who couldn't read, couldn't work, couldn't succeed at anything the world valued, but who learned to fly. Because a Joseph of Cupertino could rise above it all, maybe you can too.